Good evening. My name is Brent Amanero. I am a 2022-2023 Poetry Coalition Fellow. During my 10-month tenure, I am assisting Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. Welcome to Season 2 of Curated Conversations, a Latinx Poetry Show. Letras Latinas is under the direction of Francisco Aragon, who served as MC for Season 1, a season whose episodes undertook deep dives into debut books, where each first book poet selected their own interlocutor. For Season 2, we're telling a different story, a transatlantic story, one that will feature conversations between US Latinx poets and British Latinx poets, respectively. Francisco Aragon and British Latinx poet Leo Boix are the co-artistic directors of the series, with additional assistance from British Latinx literary activist Natalie Teitler, who co-directs Un Nuevo Sol, our presenting partner in the UK. Yours truly will serve as MC. Season 2 is made possible thanks to a grant from the Poetry Foundation and the collaboration of the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland, who, once again, is our host and co-presenter alongside Poet Lore. Special thanks to Zach Powers of the Writers Center for his crucial behind-the-scenes assistance. Tonight, we're sharing the second episode of the season, one which will present a conversation between Andrés N, Ordorica, and Christopher Soto. In this episode, Andrés and Christopher discuss their books, At Least This I Know, and Diaries of a Terrorist, respectively. Andrés and Christopher meet for the first time to discuss the idea of belonging and the definition of the word home, the intersection of poetry and activism, and the difficulty of defining poetic craft. The exchange develops naturally as the conversation moves from spoken word and Instagram poetry to abolitionism and religion. Enjoy.
Well, hello, Christopher. It's nice to spend some time with you this evening, evening my time from what is sunny but cold Edinburgh.
Nice to see you. Nice to chat with you too. I'm over here outside of LA, and it's perpetual summer per usual. I think it's the morning, so my day's getting started and yours is coming to close. But I'm glad that we could chat across continents.
Definitely, yes. I would love some of the warmth. The trees have been delayed this year, so there's no leaves, and I feel that it's really thrown me for a loop in terms of where I am in the year. I feel like I'm in perpetual winter.
Oh, yeah. You need some palm trees.
Oh, that would be
They're
lovely.
just like consistent year round. But anyhow, should we jump into the conversation today? I know we have about 60 minutes. We're going to chat about each other's books. For folks who are listening, we'll start off with a biography. We'll read a poem, and then we'll just have like a conversation. We've both prepped some questions, so maybe let me double check this Google Doc really quick, and I think you're doing the introduction first of me, right?
Yes, and it is my honor to introduce you. So, Christopher Soto is a poet based in Los Angeles, California. His debut poetry collection, Diaries of a Terrorist, was published by Copper Canyon Press. This collection demands the abolition of policing and human caging. In 2022, he was honored with THEM's Now Award in Literature for representing the cutting edge of queer culture. He was also honored as part of Out 100, which celebrates the year's most impactful and influential LGBTQ+ people. Boston Globe named his debut one of the best books of 2022.
All right, and now I'll read. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'll read from Diaries of a Terrorist. The first poem, or the poem I'd like to read, is Barebacking the Barback. Were his retired slut on food stamps forever, sniffing horse tranquilizer, seeing digital dreams, the sweet and cherry boy pussy is a great machine twice. Faggots chased down the nude avenue, stalked, photographed, buying. Burner phones, a cellophane sound of cyber threats. Entropy, and the new brutal black midnight public crying. We spoke literally. We lost obsidian and a job on the dark web. We were harassed, scissoring our femme queen, and he violined a bit nervously the skies, a constellation of arrows. Something gold feathered, forgiveness, forgive us for speaking. We spoke, smelling like dog piss and disappointment. Everyone hurt. Spat diamonds on the sand. Hell is temperate climate compared to this life without you. And that's from Diaries of a Terrorist. I'll read your bio now.
All right.
Andrés N. Ordorica is a queer Latinx writer based in Edinburgh. His writing maps the journey of his diasporic experience and unpacks what it means to be from ni de aquí ni de allá. He has been published widely, including The Guardian, The Skinny, 14 Poems, Gutter, and Wasafiri. His writing has been shortlisted for the Saltire Society's Poetry Book of the Year, the Morley Prize from Unpublished Writers of Colour, and the Mo Siewcharran Prize. He is the author of the poetry collection, At Least This I Know, published by 404 Inc. How We Named the Stars, his debut novel, is forthcoming in 2024 with Tin House. And here's the poetry book we'll be chatting about today.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to read the poem that serves as the epilogue for my collection. So this is Mis Raíces. We are in the desert, lips cracked, mouth dried like freshly milled maíz. The ground sighs as if inconvenienced by each of our steps over its thirsty ochre. There are tall green nopales lined in neat rows, reminding me how even here abundance is possible. Grandfather asks me my thoughts of the land, so I ask him if this is where we come from. Sí, mijo, half of you is from this desert. I lick my lips, parched like the earth, take my boots off, then my dirty socks. Stomp my feet to the beat of the jarabe tapatío, digging deeper into the soil with each kick. What are you doing? Asks my grandfather. I want to be a nopal, papa. I want to grow. So he leaves me, then returns with a shovel, carefully plants me into this weathered landscape. Afterward, he kisses me goodbye with such strength before patting my soft head, and in his touch, I know I will be fine here. All will be fine. The desert is mine if I want it. Here, I'll learn how to grow. And so my grandfather begins the return journey alone. The ground calls after him, but I stay quiet because I know I will be fine here. All will be fine. I am the true vine, and the desert is my gardener. It's mine to inherit because I am of both land and root. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll start us off with the first question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I'd love if you could tell me about your literary influences. Who were they? What did you pull from their craft or sense of purpose? And more broadly, what does craft mean to you?
This is such a beautiful and generous question. In terms of literary influences, one standout, and not as a poet, but also because I write between poetry and prose. One of my favorite writers who I return to over and over again is Nicole Krauss. And what I love about Krauss is how she writes her world building and how she's able to center a reader in her novels that often are sort of traversing different time periods, often sort of exploring characters' relations to their Jewish ancestry and being part of the larger Jewish diaspora. I think as a writer, for me, I've always been really interested in using writing as a way to explore notions of belonging or senses of lack thereof belonging, and being able to do that through sort of different characters that maybe come from the same family but are from different generations. And that's something, you know, Krauss often does as a device within her novels. In terms of poetry, I would say one of my biggest influences is the Scottish poet Edwin Morgan, who is an incredible poet. He lived until quite late in life, until his 90s, I believe. He came out in his 40s, but didn't come out publicly until he was in his 70s. And that was more out of a political move of dealing with a very specific law that was happening in the UK at the time called Section 28, which basically made it illegal to talk about gays or lesbians within the public school system. And very much is sort of mirroring what we see happening right now in the US. But Morgan, I think for me, the way his poetry is just filled with desire and love, but often in a coded way, because he was writing during a period where he had to sort of be very coded. His playfulness with language and sound, for me, yeah, in terms of craft is something I try to do, especially in this collection, in writing. You know, I don't write ever primarily in Spanish. I think I've written like maybe 2 poems in the course of my life that were ever entirely in Spanish, but being able to sort of play with language and kind of hear the sounds of Spanish versus English and try to weave those within a poem. I don't know if that's necessarily answering the question in terms of what does craft mean for me particular, but I think in terms of writing and my practice and approach to poetry and prose is always sort of centered in this idea of what does it mean to belong, and for to kind of tease that out in different characters, whether it's sort of belonging in terms of a racial or ethnic sense, or sort of coming from an immigrant family, or probably more often than not in a queer sense. What is it to come out of the proverbial closet and try to find home and community? And for me, poetry especially is a really great tool for exploring that myself. But yeah, I think just what a generous first question to have been offered. So thank you.
I'm a little Aquarius. I already warned you that I like my tangents, so maybe I can tangent, because I feel like we're already here into like the core questions that I wanted to ask about geography and belonging.
Yeah.
So can I?
Yeah, please.
All right, wonderful. Also, for the listeners, Andres and I just met like maybe 5 minutes ago, so it's like y'all are peeping into a first date as well. A craft talk and us getting so yeah, I loved hearing you mention geography and belonging. Those are things that kind of echo throughout your book. I was wondering if you could speak first a little bit more to belonging, like the dedication in your book speaks to a sense of belonging or not belonging. And then the first poem, names these ways that you have not felt belonging or have sought a desire to various iterations of belonging, whether it's, throughout the book, it's like whether it's like belonging to a nation or a language or a person or queerness or various, various homes. there's always this kind of feeling of being there but not being there, of belonging of not belonging. And then near the end of the book, it kind of walks us towards like a home or a sense of belonging amongst the partner, but then also there's like the story with like, or the poem with like your grandfather, and belonging in sense of like one's familial land and history. So I was wondering how you relate to that word, and also how you had mapped that journey throughout the book.
Yeah, oh gosh, what a good question. I think for me, the relation to the word is always sort of like an unfulfilled exploration, and I don't know that I'll ever reach the end. I grew up, my father joined the US Air Force quite young. They had my mom and my dad had my older brother very young, as teenagers in high school. And, they came from a very working class, small town in Northern California. And so as a means to try to make ends meet, my dad decided to join the military. And so just by a strange way of his career, we spent me and my siblings spent a lot of our lives growing up outside of the US. My dad got stationed quite a bit throughout both Europe and Asia. And so there was this strange sense, like kind of knowing that my family's Americanness, if you will, wasn't that old. All four of my grandparents came over from Mexico to the US in the 1960s. And so it was like this strange thing to like grow up in that way and be American, but have spent most of my life outside of the US, and return to the US and like visit my grandparents and always have them sort of like read as Mexican, like first and foremost, even though by the time two of my grandparents are still alive, but by the time they sort of reach their 70s and 80s, will have spent almost the entirety of their lives outside of Mexico. And like this strange sort of sensation of like, how then does one make sense of identity when you're told you're American, but your family's sort of always read or tied to their sort of immigrant story? And then, is there actually satisfaction in that? And then outside that, sort of with my own queer awakening, it's kind of having grown up in this very masculine world of the military. And then within, my own Mexican heritage and sort of greater Latinidad, this sense of like machismo, and not kind of belonging in that sense of not necessarily ever feeling like I resonated with like my father or my grandfathers or my uncles or my brothers, like sense of what it was to be a man, or what I was told was what a man was meant to be. And so I think for me, this kind of idea of belonging is probably also coupled with this word, this idea of like voyeurism, and always like looking towards groups and trying to sort of suss out, where do I feel most safe? Where do I feel most at ease? And I think how that works then within the book, it sort of starts, there's the prologue poem, so it sits outside of, is the one you referenced, where it's someone kind of experiencing the trauma of like the literal trauma of going through a border in a state of of immigration, and having to explain oneself, and just like this fear of trying to articulate, hoping like almost with your eyes covered in a bandana and just throwing darts at the dartboard, like thinking if he can just name one group that is deemed correct, then he will be welcomed into the fold. I use that poem almost to fill sort of, the poem in itself is sort of filled with Easter eggs that will then hopefully for the reader be unfurled as they make their way through the collection of these different ideas of what it could mean to belong, and sort of the speaker of the poem, who I kind of see as being the same speaker throughout, is kind of making his way towards the end, trying to kind of find belonging in a place. And you reference you know, the lover, the husband, that features a lot. It especially gets a whole sort of section exploring a very particular relationship. I think, yeah, that was sort of another way of teasing out, like, finding home. So yes, I think in a more succinct way to answer your question, for me, the idea of belonging probably means home, and finding home in different ways. But I often feel that, like, there's still room to answer that question, hopefully by the end of the collection, and that you know, necessarily you don't have to feel fixed, that there is the possibility of, like, growth, because it's really, for me, it's about reaching this sort of point of clarity that I can say, that I have the agency to say that belonging in home ultimately needs to be tied to wherever I feel the most safe. And if a place is not serving me in that way, I have the right to explore somewhere else, to go further afield and root myself somewhere else.
That's a super interesting. My mind is, like, trying to catch up to that right now. Like, home, like, I can understand, like, definitions of home being transient, various iterations of home, like, being transient, especially for people who move and live in transnationally and across identity markers. And yeah, so kind of like the transience of this idea of home makes sense to me. And then when you threw in the word safe there, my mind is like, all right, pause, wait, what? I think partially because of my histories, this idea of home hasn't necessarily always equated to safety. So I think that maybe that's where we're doing the poet thing, where there's, like, the literal geography of home, and then there's, like, the poetic relationship to the idea of home. And I think maybe that's kind of what's embodied, that tension is kind of what's embodied in the book, is, like, there's geography of home, like the structure of the house, the city, county, state, whatever. But then there's, like, that feeling of safety and security, which leads to, like, a belonging. And, like, that feeling, that poetic feeling of home is what allows, like, for the transience, and it allows for, like, a more rootedness. So I think, yeah, I think that I can understand that. And I think maybe as, like, queer people or diasporic peoples, like, that incongruity between, like, the emotional feeling of home and, like, the physical structure, geographical location, which is often considered, like, the sole relationship to one's home, is kind of where a lot of queer people, myself included, feel tension. I think the same thing with, like, family.
Definitely, yeah, that kind of, and I think especially when we're sort of forced, if not forced, at least asked to participate in this very sort of heteronormative sense of what is it to be home, and this kind of almost assumption, you know. And I think often this sort of surfaces for a lot of people, not even that you have to be part of, like, the LGBTQ plus community, but anyone really around the holidays, or sort of very Western Judeo-Christian holidays of Christmas, and in the US and Canada, Thanksgiving. But, like, this idea of, like, you're supposed to, oh, don't you want to go home and see your family and, like, be stuck with them for a week? And this idea for a lot of people, there is this unease, and if not unease, like, almost even a tension or a feeling of, like, unsafe, or you just don't feel like you can totally be yourself, or you almost have to start sort of shutting down aspects of the self. And I like you sort of picking up that sense of boundaries, whether it's sort of municipal boundaries or the boundary of the house, but that for lots of people who are sort of operating or living within margins or come from or are part of marginalized communities, that sense of home or belonging can sort of take on that very poetic, it's almost an ethereal or atmospheric sense, and it doesn't necessarily always align with sort of brick and mortar and the sense of like being in an actual home. Sometimes it's a space or a communion, or for some people too, it could even be digital spaces can present a home if their actual physical home is not serving them.
Yeah, and I think also like this idea of home, I think maybe your book like obviously like expands that definition, but I think part of the problem with having a narrow definition of the idea of home as it relates to like a physical structure or geography is, and it doesn't include, feelings of safety or belonging, as you've noted, is that it kind of allows, if home is only defined by like property ownership, the physical structure and the geography, then it allows for, state violence to be committed. Specifically, I'm thinking about like in Los Angeles, all of my unhoused neighbors, quote, unhoused neighbors. And, there's so many gentrifiers here who are uncomfortable with unhoused and calling police on unhoused neighbors. And I'm just like, a lot of these homies I've seen in this, my unhoused neighbors, like, quote, quote, I've seen in this neighborhood longer than a lot of the gentrifiers. And so it's like, because of people's relationship to property ownership or geography or land or the material goods, and the confinement of the word home to often like neglect that feeling of emotional security or safety or belonging. Like that's why some people think that they're more at home in a particular space than others. But yeah, thank you so much for having that introductory question with me. It was gave me something to chew on a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to sort of be able to ask you a question now. And I think what really excites me about sort of starting with this question is it's something that is so evident in your work of the personal and the political being very interwoven in your poetry. So I would, as my first question to you, Christopher, would love to hear your thoughts about this intersection of your poetic practice and your activist work. It's funny that you sort of referenced for the audience watching us today or this evening, wherever they are in the world. Yes, we only did meet in the sort of physical, digital sense this evening, but I've been following you for quite a few years now. And the work you do in particular, you sort of first came across my radar from your work as an editor with Nepatla, a journal dedicated to queer poets of color, and then your co-founding of the Undocu Poets campaign. And then, of course, your beautiful debut, Diaries of a Terrorist. So to get to my question, I would love to know if you were always immediately drawn to using poetry to sort of embody your activist work, and did you always see them as coming together in communion, or was this something that sort of unfurled? Were they always synchronous, or did they sort of just, how did that kind of come to fruition?
Yeah, so my first poem was written in first grade, and so my prompt was really that like my teacher would give us candy if we would write. And so it wasn't anything too and the motive was candy. But I continued to write, and I've always been attracted to letters, even just like I remember in first grade, like trying to write cursive before all of my peers, and on one of my spelling tests, I had to write an N, and I forgot like one of the like humps in the N. And then I got the word wrong, and I felt so ashamed. I'm like 32 and still talking about it. But so I've always been attracted to letters and literature and writing. And in high school, that ended up in me forming a spoken word poetry club, and I'd host these big like poetry readings with maybe like 2,000 students. Like the whole school would come out, and a lot of the community would come out. We'd have break dancers, drum line, people who were like graffiti artists selling like their shirts. We would raise money at that time for Darfur because I was a kid, and a lot of that was happening at that time. I was also on the Inland Empire Spoken Word Club, and in those years, SB 1070 anti-immigration legislation, and there was like legislation about gay marriage being passed or not in California. I believe that was Prop 8. So around my high school years, I was talking and speaking and writing about those issues and hosting fundraising events via literature. And also like going through domestic violence and speaking about that. So I feel like since high school, and that's also aside from competing on the slam poetry team in high school, that's also when I published my first poem because my high school English teacher was like, oh, here's a youth publishing competition. So it started really young for me. I feel very fortunate for that. I feel like I've always kind of been circling more or less the same themes in writing and addressing them via poetry. But I think what's happening now after, my debut poetry book is that I feel like I'm having a different relationship to letters and literature. In high school, it was oration and spoken word and performance. And then, eventually I went to NYU, and it was kind of just like master class on craft for a few years. And just from reading and traveling to different poets across the US and Latin America and being able to speak, like right now we're speaking from Europe to the US too, I've really come to be a bit tired with craft in a sense. And what I mean by that is that specifically in the American literary world, I see three markets. I see quote markets. I know that markets and literary craft are not synonymous, but bear with me. I see like a spoken word community of writers and spoken word world and a history of like poetry as oration. And the metrics by which you constitute good craft for spoken word poetry may be like the fluctuations in your voice and like how you hold your body, how you stand, how you move, your emotional, like the emotional resonance of your face in relationship to like the words being spoken. So there's a whole value of like how you approach craft. So for example, when I was writing spoken word poetry and performing spoken word poetry, I would rely more on like sonic value, alliteration, assonance, repetition. It'd have a lot of refrain so that the listener and the audience, when they walk away from the poem, then they're able to remember like the core message of the poem. And so I think a lot of times in the literary world, we don't view spoken word as craft, but it's highly crafted. And the literary which I mean like predominantly white publishing houses and academic markets. So I think that's kind of the second like literary home in the United States is these white publishing houses and academic markets. And that's a lot of the times what controls like media and journalism as well. I think a lot of spoken word poets would probably agree that books desk at major journalist sites might be overlooking their work, their craft, and their cultural contributions to like letters and oration. But I think right now we also have a third kind of canon or craft in the United States that I think is kind of going maybe under-recognized, and all of the people in these kind of three economies, markets, communities, whatever, are also do have overlap. But I think about like when discussions about whether Rupi Kaur could write or not, like I thought those were really interesting and are totally worth reapproaching. And I still want to write an essay on it later, but I think with Rupi Kaur, you know, she is an Insta poet, and I read Insta poetry as closed form. And right now I'm trying to understand, and I read Insta poetry as a third market. And I think the form of Insta poetry, it's like you have these tiny little grids, you know, and then you're adjust the success of the poem is that a lot of the times is influenced by is defined by its virality. So it's not whether or not like you get into the Paris Review, it's whether or not the poem gets viral on on Instagram. So like Insta poets will incorporate like visual, like little flowers into the poem. And like, so they're working craft and they're trying to hit that metric of like virality, because that's what quote validates their relationship to craft. Debatable again. And then things like the algorithm changes, and all of a sudden like static posts are put to the back burner in relationship to like content, like moving content, like short films. And so then Insta poets need to change their craft in order to meet the metric of virality. So that's like a third community market and form. And this is just within like English speaking like literature within the United States. So when I start to think about literature like transnationally and across like languages, my mind just like it just, you know, like it's definitions of craft are so arbitrary and so wide and so ever shifting that for me to pursue a narrow definition of craft feels irrelevant. And so what I've realized in this book is that what I'm interested is not quote craft, because oftentimes that's like this westward expansionist white supremacist idea of let's discover new stories. And what I'm interested in instead is purpose. So what is the purpose of the poem? What is the purpose of the book? What is the purpose of the writing? And the works that I feel most interested in a lot of the times are very tied emotionally to their purpose. And beyond that, for myself, I have come to identify as like someone who's interested in agitprop or propaganda, agitated propaganda. And so I'm like, if my interest is not like poetic craft, and my interest is like how to produce abolitionist or like pro-migrant or pro-queer propaganda, like how does that shape like the literature that I'm producing? So in a long-winded way, I've been writing for a long time. It's been influenced by movement spaces I've been involved with, and as I've related to craft differently, the way that I approach my perspective and how I view literature's ability to create quote social change has shifted as well.
Yeah, I mean, I find like it's such a brilliant answer, and there's so much to sort of mull through. But I think what's really interesting is hearing about like the genesis of your writing, and that intrigue sort of coming from an early age, but also just knowing then that, and it totally fits the world of this collection, this idea that even from a very young age, from being a high schooler, you still found a way, or there was always sort of this symbiosis between your poetry and your spoken word work and your political work. And just even hearing like that you know, organizing these performance nights, and that, you know, to not just include poetry, but that you said, you know, there was breakdancing, and that you sort of really look towards the community. And I think that that feels like the natural genesis for a writer who wrote this collection. And I like sort of your aversion now to this idea of craft. But even still, like reading your, I think it's so, it sounds such a trite phrase now after just what was a brilliant sort of response you gave. But I do think it is so well crafted, and you're doing something that's very interesting on the page. And what I find really fascinating is it reminds me a lot, there is this British poet named Inwa Alams, who is a playwright, a poet, a spoken word artist. And very similarly, his work plays with the page in similar ways that you're doing, and even using sort of the forward slash. And I think, yeah, I love that sort of tension. And I do have sort of a crafty question, though. And I'm going to ask it anyway, because it does sort of speak to what you're doing. And I love that you brought up these words of agitation, of propaganda, of abolition. And this is definitely a brilliant collection that reads as a form of abolitionist propaganda. And for me, something that was such a standout through reading it was over and over again, you use, and I don't want to sort of infer it as a device, so I'm just going to say you use we throughout the collection in your poems. And I would love to know how the voice of this we is positioned in relation to the myriad of characters and ideas and places and issues that you interrogate. Where does that voice come from, and what are you attempting to do by moving away from the expected I of a speaker in a poem?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And then I want to jump to craft with you. But I think with the spoken word performances and then my early chapbook Sad Girl poems prior to my debut collection, I was talking a lot about like domestic violence and housing and policing through the I pronoun. And I think that when I was publishing work while I was at grad school at NYU, I felt like I was so close in proximity to a lot of these histories of like violence and instability, and I was still kind of at risk. And I was almost like trying to theorize my own existence while writing about it. And it was interesting. I look back on like those early writings and I'm like, I disagree with that. I disagree with that. I disagree with that. But I was doing so much work like to understand myself, to figure it out, to like, there was so many just open wounds. There was a lot to work through. There was a lot to work through. And I was publishing during and meeting a lot of literary people during that. And some people who may not have seen me, you know, I'm sure there's poets who have only seen me in my NYU days who may not even recognize me today. But I think what happened in the last decade as I was writing this book was like, I felt like I needed a moment away from the I pronoun to like figure out my own shit. Like, I was like, don't hold me accountable to like this narrative or this story or my ideas related to any of this. I'm trying to figure out what like domestic violence is, what housing is, what Latinidad is, what LA literature is, what queerness and transness. Like, when I started identifying as non-binary, it's like, we weren't even coalesced around the word like non-binary. It was like agender, gender non-conforming, gender queer, gender fucker. Like, we didn't even have like consolidated language. And so I think I kind of got disinterested in speaking like as like a certified figure, or writing as like a published author or an expert. Like, I don't view myself as an expert. And I think that's also how I read people like Anzaldúa, is like, I'm like, for me, when I read her, I'm like, she's always kind of just critiquing and evolving and learning, like learning in public. And I think that's what my literature feels like. So in one sense, the we pronoun felt like an abandonment of like my authority over particular experiences or ideas. But I think also for me, I felt most settled in the we pronoun when I tried to think about it within the context of like American letters and literature. So like, and abolitionist thought. And so I was like, I feel like prisons and policing and instances of police violence are often thought to happen to like singular individuals, when in reality, like that violence, that state violence happens to whole communities. So if the police, I won't say arrest, but if the police kidnap someone, extract them from their social and economic lives, like that violence is not just felt by that individual, it's felt by the children, the mother, father, the cousins, the neighbors. And it's not like it only happens once to that individual, it's like it happens throughout all of our communities. And so I became less interested in, I think, American isolationism and this idea that like these experiences are uniquely held by me. And I wanted to write from the we pronoun to push against that feeling and be like, no, I'm writing amongst my community and we're experiencing this together. So that's a little bit of a shift, but still kind of on this fumbly word of craft. I'd love to ask you about how you approach religion and specifically Christianity in your work. There was a few places where I started to think about like prayer as a closed form, and how like this, and how one's prayer or prayer as a closed form could influence like their approach to the poem or the craft of the poem.
Yeah, again, such a generous question and close reading. I think for me, I mean, I'm someone who very much grew up in the church, and very much in a very Catholic family. And so I think the language of prayer and like this echo of Catholicism is still there and probably so deeply rooted and ingrained in me. I think I think it's something, again, in my sort of deep perplexed state of trying to wrangle with this idea of belonging, religion and spirituality will always be part of that questioning and that kind of examination. And the idea, I think prayer and the language of prayer is so woven throughout so many of these poems. I think what I am fascinated in trying to do that or use prayer or the language of prayer in that way is just almost in conversation with other poets who have done it probably, and not probably, like have 100% done it way better than me. But I think of writers like Danae Smith, and here in the UK, Joelle Taylor, whose brilliant T.S. Eliot winning collection, Canto and Other Poems, totally uses this idea of the praise poem throughout. And I had the good fortune of doing a master class a few years ago with Joelle, all about sort of using the praise poem, but literally queering it for the LGBTQ plus community, and sort of finding your most not niche, because that sounds like a pejorative in this sense, but to really home in on, we were asked by Joelle to home in on our most immediate sort of community under that queer umbrella, and like try to write to that person, to those people. And for me, I think the idea of prayer, using prayer in that way, in the poetic way, it works really well, because I even think of like just Catholic poems, Catholic prayers I grew up with, they sort of have a very poetic structure. It almost makes me think of like a sonnet in form, or a Shakespearean sonnet that often ends with like a couplet that wraps it all up. And I think of Yeah, just almost like this kind of using that last couplet to kind of turn the poem in and of on itself, of like these just crazy notions of like, you know, praying the Hail Mary and it seeming like a prayer to Mary, but then right at the end you make it all about yourself and like, please, you know, Holy Mother, watch over me, or like you know, the Our Father, especially at where it comes within a Catholic Mass, that you're meant to be praying over the Eucharist and welcoming the body of Christ. But then, you know, this kind of dogmatic Catholic sense of like eternally being banished to hell. You also, right at the end, and kind of like, and please forgive me of my trespasses and those I trespass. And I just think there's just such brilliant, like when you unpack prayers, they actually are so eloquently written because they're so they're almost so OTT in terms of language and simile and analogy and I think for me as a poet, it's really interesting to play with that, especially when, you know, I can sort of excise my mother's voice from my head and not think, oh, I'm going to get in trouble for this, and like use it in a very queer way and add sort of desire, or to play with it, you know, like in the poem that ends my epilogue, it's taken from, I think the Book of John, and I like this idea. Again, there's other poets, especially other queer poets, who have done this in the past, and I think have given me permission to use prayer in that way and to kind of allow my relationship to religion and Catholicism and spirituality to be what I want it to be at any given time. And I like what you said. Oh, it was so brilliant. You said that, yeah, you reject this idea of being the expert, and you allow yourself to always be learning in public. And I think for me, my relationship to spirituality and prayer will always be ever changing, but I allow myself as a writer to kind of continue to hold on to that language as long as I need it, as long as it is helpful for me. And so, yeah, I don't know if I got there in the end with the answer, but it did give me a lot of food for thought.
And no, you gave me food for thought too. I think as you were speaking, I also started to realize that a lot of what I love about literature is kind of exemplified in like liturgical literatures or prayer. So for example, like prayers like the Our Father, like, can that be spoken word? Like, is that a spoken word, like a poem of oration when you're, you know, singing it or performing it or reading it or praying it, like at church and community? Like all, and the Bible itself, like if particular prayers are like poetic forms in the Bible, is like prose, like is like liturgical literature also interdisciplinary in that sense, like going from like prose to verse?
Yeah. I mean, you even think of sort of like the Book of Psalms is like a brilliant example of poetry. Like there are very little stanzas. Or, I mean, I think, yeah, it could even be prose poems. I think of like one of my favorite quotes or parts of the Bible is Ecclesiastes, and the idea of like there's a time for sadness, there's a time for mourning, there's a time for joy. And like to me, that is a poem. Like how brilliant would it be if, especially if those of us who grew up in the church and if we have sort of a distant relationship or we have an aversion to it now, if we reclaim that sort of, and sort of what would your time be now? What would be the time for, or, you know, how would you see that? But I do know that those watching us, the time is winding down. And I do have a question that I want to sneak in here for you, Christopher, while we have your time, because I really think I personally want to hear your thoughts. Again, your collection is just so brilliantly centered in this idea of abolition, and you know, the political. And I am very interested in sort of speaking about a very particular poem that I hope, or poems, and I hope two poems that I think will hopefully speak to the wider collection on the whole. But I would love to know, and again, we're going to go from craft to practice, but how do colonial histories and queer histories and the idea of queer elders in the archive inform your practice? And I particularly am thinking of your poem, Two Loves in Perfect Synchrosity, which was deeply, deeply moving. And then your ending poem, The Hammer Realized Its Life Purpose. Both of these poems hold so much space for love and desire and anger, but they also share very real, violent histories whilst uplifting communities who have and continue to fight for survival. So yeah, I'm interested in sort of hearing your thoughts on how different concepts of histories and elders and even the archive, because it feels like some of these poems are actually pulling from, you know, the archive. How do you approach those? Because they are very lofty ideas to kind of explore within the poetic form.
I just keep on thinking about your book. I'm not ready to talk about mine. I've thought about mine enough. I want to talk about you. All right, briefly on you. Earlier when we were talking about geographies, I wanted to bring Andre Nafis Salih into the conversation, who also feels similarly like just a person of global literatures and is currently the poetry editor of the editor at Poetry London. So this is just for I guess the listeners or the viewers that love your literature to also look at Andres. And then when we were having the conversation about liturgical literatures being like moving across genres and also having spoken word, I think there are also like moments of like propaganda that influence like policy, which is interesting for me. Maybe we obviously have, the Catholic Church and I have some discrepancies, but I think that literature that moves praxis is interesting to me. And at that moment, I wanted to bring Alicia Nicole Harris into the conversation, who is like a literary friend of mine who's deeply committed to her Christian faith. And we always just like spitball on like the intersection of like literature and Christianity, or trans rights and Christianity, and she's so much more well-versed. And I was like, no, tap me out, like bring Alicia here, bring Alicia here. But all right, moving on to your question, as it relates to those two poems, I'll start with talking about the archive. And I think a lot of what happens in this debut poetry book, Diaries of a Terrorist, is I reference a lot of other like queer Latinos, like similar to you, looking for a home or safety or likeness. Queer Latino writers and artists are mentioned throughout the book in histories. So in the poem Two Lovers in Perfect Synchronicity, that is written in conversation with Felix Gonzalez Torres, who is a queer Latino visual artist who died of AIDS-related complications. And I was trying to bridge the gap between my generation and the generation of queer Latino artists who had preceded us, because I was like, this is like the lineage of writers and artists who would have been our mentors, who would have been our friends, who would have guided us, who would have understood our literature and advocated for us to win these awards. Like, I've been kind of quiet about it because the book has done so well and I don't want to whine, but like my debut book was well reviewed at a lot of everywhere that I could have wanted. Like, there's not much more I could have wanted. And yes, it won like the Now Award in literature, or representing the cutting edge of queer literature and so on. But I haven't been long-listed for any of the literary awards in like the traditional white publishing establishment. And I don't think it's because the book isn't good or wasn't well reviewed or wasn't well received or anything. I'm like, imagine trying to get like 5 people to agree that they want to celebrate a book about abolitionist thought. Like, you know, I know that there's certain systemic barriers that prohibit me from, you know, accessing spaces. I've had events canceled, poems withdrawn from acceptances, I've received threats, etc., because of the political content of my book. And so sometimes as a writer, I think about, the generation of queer Black and Latino artists before us who passed away from during the AIDS pandemic. And I'm just like, damn, like that could have meant, like, what if, Essex Hemphill was still around and read the book and was like, fuck you all. Like, we're pushing this on the long list. Not to say these words mean shit, but that loss of so many beautiful minds and people in the generation before us, I wanted to bridge that community and trying to bridge that disconnect and imagine like what it might be to still have some of those elders with us. So I think I do some of that work in relationship to the poem, the closing poem. Then the hammer realized its life purpose. I organized the book in 4 sections to kind of be an on-ramp for readers. So the first section talks about like police violence literally in front of my house. The second section talks about juvenile detention regionally. The third section moves more broadly to talk about global relationships to policing. And it has a lot of embodiment poems that go from and the poems go from like Palestine to India to El Salvador to the United States. And then the last poem that you mentioned, Then the Hammer Realized Its Life Purpose, is my way of trying to understand like more of a philosophical approach to what constitutes as like violence and safety. And I do that by talking about the 3 ways that my body has been hit. So domestic violence, boxing, and through kink. And in those 3 instances, I have been hit, but all of those have elicited like different emotional reactions. And there's this professor at Yale, Michael Warner, who says like to name something violence is to immediately stand outside of it. And so and I think that happens with the carceral state too, is that like the carceral state does not name itself as perpetuating violence because it doesn't stand outside of it. Like, And so I wanted to think about like what safety could actually mean when defining words like violence is so hard. And I think, to be engaged in abolitionist thought around those ideas is inherently tied to anti-colonial struggles, because in part it's like the police in the carceral state is made to protect like land ownership and colonized like land ownership, private property, and like the colonial state. And so to move against policing and carcerality is part of a lineage of, resistance to, the white settler state. I see a note that says we have 5 minutes or so left, and that was like 3 minutes ago. So
There's so much that we could unpack, but I mean, I think your last answer for me, Christopher, was just so generous and just so rich for thought, of just thinking about how you use some of these poems as a means to bridge through the gap and sort of the love and the care and consideration you have for those elders that we have lost, and what we, not only the loss in the sense of like mourning, but what we of our generation have lost by not having them, by being denied sort of these elders and these mentors. And you said something earlier on in one of your answers in your approach to using poetry in an abolitionist way, of that these things don't happen in isolation to the individual, but they often affect whole communities, and there's just wider ramifications. And so for me, it's just a brilliant opportunity to spend, this last hour with you, being able to sort of speak and hear more about your beautiful work, and to just be able to answer some of your generous questions. Because like I said earlier on in our conversation, you are a poet that I've been following for quite a while. And so for me, it was a great honor to be asked by Letras Latinas and the Writer Center to spend time with you. So thank you for, just...
Likewise, thank you too. My mind is just completely spinning about, ideas of home and belonging and transnational writing and writing across genres in the place of home and family and prayer. It's a really beautiful way to start the day. So thank you so much. And for readers, make sure to get, the poetry book over here.
Yes.
I guess that's all of our time, right?
Yeah. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was lovely to chat.